Venezuela is now responding with electronic jamming and some small military exercises off its coast, which really raises the risk of a confrontation or some accident that could bring this thing really to a head. So there are a number of scenarios, but one is the Venezuelan boats maybe stray too close, or the planes, or could stray too close to U.S. ships and trigger a reaction. They could be shot down by the U.S., would immediately escalate this conflict. Venezuela would feel compelled to respond. Maybe even other countries in the region would feel compelled to respond. Another scenario also is that the Venezuelan forces accidentally fire on the United States. In that case, the U.S. would most definitely respond because, of course, its Army personnel would be placed in risk and in harm's way. And that would probably trigger even more of a full-on reaction, perhaps even bombing inside the country.
Hello and welcome to Times Radio. I'm Arjuna Keshwani-Ham, and today we're joined by Christopher Sabatini. He's a senior fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. Chris, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Venezuela has started days of military and electronic warfare drills on its Caribbean island of La Orquilla amid soaring tensions with the US. Most significantly, this includes Washington's strikes on at least two Venezuelan boats, which, according to the US, were transporting drugs across the Caribbean, operations in which so far at least 14 have been killed. Actions which the UN has pegged as extrajudicial killing. Now, it's been reported that there's no actual evidence to support Trump's claim that that first speedboat was actually a drug boat. There's even been skepticism as to whether the boat was even capable of covering the 2,000-kilometer journey to the US where Trump claimed it was heading. Is there a chance that this could lead to conflict between Venezuela and the US?
I think a confrontation would have to occur through accident. The U.S. is not going to invade Venezuela. The force that it has there is only 4,500 personnel, 2,200 of which are Marines. But you can't invade a country of 28 million people with multiple urban centers, jungles, mountains, with 2,200 Marines. Having said that, what could happen, possibly, is that one of the Venezuelan boats, and there are a number of scenarios, but one is the Venezuelan boats maybe stray too close, or the planes, or could stray too close to U.S. ships and trigger a reaction. They could be shot down by the U.S., would immediately escalate this conflict. Venezuela would feel compelled to respond. Maybe even other countries in the region would feel compelled to respond. Another scenario also is that the Venezuelan forces accidentally fire on the United States. In that case, the U.S. would most definitely respond because, of course, its Army personnel would be placed in risk and in harm's way. And that would probably trigger even more of a full-on reaction, perhaps even bombing inside the country. But all of these, when you have in such close quarters military assets that are patrolling those quarters, that are trying, in the case of Venezuela, also to jam and engaging in electronics interference. There are all sorts of scenarios that could take place in which they accidentally just cross paths, they accidentally inflame or provoke the other one. And then I think, quite frankly, a conflict of some sort, maybe it would be scaled back, but a conflict of some sort would almost be inevitable.
So can you give us some background as to what's gone on here? And what is Trump's real intention? What is he actually trying to achieve?
I think there's several. The first one primarily is domestic. He campaigned on spreading the fear of this criminal group, Tren de Agua, claiming actually that it had taken over a town in Colorado, claiming wrongly that isn't true. The Aurora mayor even said that wasn't true. It was a building. So he needs to continue to stoke this fear of criminal organizations, criminal immigrants. Not all immigrants are criminal. In this case, Tren de Agua is, but he wants to reinforce this idea that to really continue to smear and instill fear in people and justify his really inhumane deportation policies. So this fits very much in that. Now he's mobilizing. There are 8 ships there, a nuclear sub. There are 4,500 personnel, including 2,200 Marines now off the coast. It's all this idea of spreading the sense that this is an invasion is imminent and that these people are real threats to the way of life and to American lives, even because of in this case, drugs. But so that's one of it. It's for domestic consumption. It's to project power, just generally in the hemisphere. But the second objective is also trying to rattle the cage of the Nicolás Maduro government. In his first term, Donald Trump tried regime change by members of his administration creating a fictional government by the National Assembly that was then democratically elected. And they elected their president and declared him the interim president of Venezuela, and they convinced more than 50 countries to recognize Juan Guaido, the interim president, so-called interim president. And the hope was that people would defect, and the military in particular would swing behind this new president in the face of mass protests and diplomatic recognition. That didn't work. So now he's really rolling out literally the heavy guns in this case. But the intent is the same. He's not about to invade. The intent in this case is basically to frighten the circle around Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who last year did, by all accounts, steal an election, declared himself president despite mounting evidence, a wealth of evidence that he lost significantly, about 60% to the opposition candidate to his 30%. But now what he's trying to do is really trying to get the military to defect. And part of this is because the opposition of Venezuela that has the ear of Secretary of State Marco Rubio has always been saying, oh, they're going to defect any minute. Now, the military is really not pro-Maduro. You can make them change their position and remove Maduro. And that's effectively what he's trying. Part of that also is he's designated several members of the government of Venezuela as being narco-terrorists, in particular under the Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, including President Maduro, his interior minister, and his defense minister, are all sort of part of this alleged narco-terrorist group. And that means, because of a leaked document from the Defense Department, now Department of War, that they can kill them and assassinate them at will. So again, it's this idea of striking fear, if you will, sort of psyops. You're really trying to get in the heads of people around Maduro and trying to provoke a regime change. So those are the two objectives. Now, in the end, he may not achieve either of them, because the truth is that most cocaine that passes through Venezuela to the United States only represents a small percentage, about 5% of the cocaine that reaches the United States. Most of it passes through the Pacific or through Central America and Mexico. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you look at these boats that he took out, as you mentioned, are small. They're just motor boats. One had 11 people in it. The other one had 2 people in it. First of all, there's no way they're going to make it to the shores of the United States. But second of all, these are not massive amounts of drugs. It's a complete hyperbolic performance to make him look tough and look like he's doing something. But as I say, it's also intended to rattle the government and rattle the military. But we've seen time and time again that these things have the opposite effect, a certain rally around the flag effect that will, I would argue, maybe it will work this time, but we've seen this movie before using other actors, if you will, another script. It's never worked.
If, as you said, regime change is desirable for the US, but perhaps not possible in the near future, how do you think this pans out? That's
the problem, is they've never defined that. Any military mission has to have a defined objective and a timeline. They never have. I mean, do we expect, and according to a friend of mine who knows the military well, this deployment alone cost about $13 million a day. Okay, so you have to wonder, at what point are they just going to hang out there and just take out individual motorboats one by one, killing people without even verifying who's on the boat, without actually seizing the drugs? That no drugs were seized. There is no confirmation that these, in fact, were drug boats, nor even confirmation of the fact that they were aligned or members of Tren de Agua, in this case, the criminal network that he's claimed they've been members of. So at what point are they just going to continue to take out boats, small boats, or maybe even send a few missiles, and the 8 ships that are off the coast do have missile capacities, and just take out maybe some drug labs or some warehouses or what have you, and then just call it quits and say, okay, job done, we're going to return now? Or are they going to get antsy and try something else? And it's difficult to imagine. knowing Donald Trump and seeing his behavior, a man who doesn't take defeat well, as we saw when he lost the 2020 elections, that he's just going to suddenly say, oh, sorry, mission not accomplished, time to pack up and come home. There is this real risk that they're there, and what they will accomplish and how that will be measured and how that will be determined is completely unclear.
Now, you've mentioned Marco Rubio, and we've had some pretty sensational rhetoric flying around between the Venezuelan and the US administrations. I believe Maduro called Rubio the Lord of Death and War, and Trump has in the past referred to Maduro as a drug lord and a cartel leader. Now, how did this relationship get so tense?
So let's be clear first. Maduro is no nice guy. The man is an autocrat. He is corrupt. His nephews, in fact, were arrested for and tried and convicted for trying to move drugs, cocaine, to the United States. And in the last year's elections, as I mentioned, he flagrantly stole them and then rounded up about 2,000 people and killed about 25 peaceful protesters. This is an autocratic regime. It is truly a corrupt regime. It is truly a blight on the democratic map of Latin America. So, there's already this. But, what we hear right now, at this point, we're seeing peak performance. By that, I don't mean athletic peak performance. I mean, we've got a performative president of the United States and a secretary of state who are, calling the president Maduro all sorts of names, maybe earned, but certainly not very diplomatic and certainly not statesmanlike. And then we have Maduro rallying a militia, calling out the troops, rallying the Navy, a naval squad. Again, peak performance to generate sort of popular support. This is, quite frankly, on neither side is this serious. Now, how did we get here? Part of this is Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio's parents came from Cuba, actually before the arrival of Fidel Castro in 1959, but his parents were staunch anti-communist, staunch anti-Fidelistas, if you will. And he inherited that. And his constituency when he was senator was primarily in the southern Florida, which has a large contingent of Cuban diaspora, of people who fled Fidel Castro and his brutal communist regime. So for many people, including Marco Rubio, Venezuela is sort of a symbol of the creeping communist takeover of Latin America. And in fact, and this is probably true, Hugo Chavez, who was first elected in 1998, sworn in 1999, who was the predecessor to Nicolas Maduro, who handpicked Nicolas Maduro, basically may have actually threw a lifeline to the Fidel Castro government when he was elected by shipping about 100,000 barrels of oil a day. The Cuban government at the time was broke. Many people thought it was on the brink of collapse. And what happened was he kept them alive. It kept them afloat. And in return, the Cuban government sent its spies and advisors who have really helped Maduro, well, previously Chavez and then Maduro, consolidate their power, root out traitors or defectors within the military. So really, for many people, for Marco Rubio as a Cuban American, Nicolas Maduro and the Venezuelan regime is enemy number one. It is their bête noire. This is something they really want to take out under the previous Trump administration. John Bolton, who was then National Security Advisor, referred to Nicolas Maduro and the government in Nicaragua and the government in Cuba as being the triangle of tyranny, also the three stooges of socialism. And there was another alliterative term that was also too cute by half. But again, this idea is the neocons and Marco Rubio are very fixated on removing this threat from the hemisphere.
I also wanted to ask you about the response to these attacks within Venezuela. I mean, I've heard that the Venezuelan opposition have remained virtually silent on the subject of the US strikes on the boats. Why is this, and what do the opposition have to achieve here?
So again, the Democratic opposition last year rallied. They held a primary. They elected one single leader, Maria Corina Machado, who was prohibited from running. And so the stand-in candidate, a retired diplomat, Edmundo Gonzalez, stood in for the opposition. The opposition really filled the streets with people during the rallies, and clearly the election was snatched from them. It was snatched from them. So for many of them, they feel frustrated. They feel they tried their best to resolve this through diplomatic channels. There was the crackdown. Many of the advisors to Maria Corina Machado, basically sort of the eminence grise of the whole opposition movement at that point, were jailed or were actually had to seek safety in the then Argentine or Argentine embassy. So those cases, for them, they're kind of applauding this. They also have sort of caught on to this idea, has been evident for months, that the only way to remove Nicolas Maduro is through a military coup or some kinetic action by the United States, because all diplomatic channels have been closed. But the problem is this, is they are remaining silent at a moment when, first of all, most Venezuelans don't actually support a U.S. intervention. And we can talk about whether the U.S. would intervene or invade. But also, basically, the Trump administration is sending back, Venezuelan deportees, putting them in prisons in El Salvador, and killing, without any due process, Venezuelan citizens, even if they are gang members, without any due process, without any hearing, just simply shooting first and not even bothering to ask questions. And the opposition remains silent in the hope that they don't want to offend the Trump administration, that eventually, if there is regime change, or eventually, if there's some sort of conflict, that the Trump administration will come to the rescue. That's a very risky strategy. And what we've seen over time, over the 2 decades, actually 25 years of the Chavez and Maduro governments, is that the opposition tends to burn through leaders. They sit out elections, they complain, they rally. Sometimes they ally themselves too closely with the United States. And I think, quite frankly, there's a real risk in this, that they will also, the current leadership of the opposition, will lose a certain amount of popular support. And the opposition will be even in a worse place than it was before.
Now, I want to talk a bit about oil, because Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, and yet comparative to what it actually has, it doesn't make much from its oil exports. And I wonder how much of what we're seeing now is actually related to these sort of years of trade tensions around oil between the US and Venezuela.
When Chavez was elected in 1998, Venezuela was pumping about 3 million barrels of oil per day. Most of that oil was going to the United States. Venezuelan crude is a heavy crude, heavy in sulfur, it's thick. And so the U.S. had special refineries in the Gulf of Mexico, I guess now it's called the Gulf of America, that were especially equipped to refine this crude. What happened was basically Hugo Chavez took over the semi-independent state oil company, PDVSA, removed a number of their engineers, packed the institution with his loyalists, and then basically broke into the bank of PDVSA and redistributed the resources. What that meant was just general levels of incompetence, lack of technical expertise to continue these wells. The second thing that happened was, in fact, the lack of investment for new exploration. And so production declined dramatically. But then in 2019, when the Trump administration moved to recognize this fictional government of Juan Guaido, it imposed what were called maximum pressure sanctions. And those sanctions basically not just prohibited United States from investing in Venezuelan oil or producing it and shipping it, but also other Western countries, including oil companies from the UK, from France, and from Italy and Spain, to name a few. So basically all oil production was shut down, and oil production completely collapsed even further than its previous rates. What has happened since under the Biden administration was they did provide some basic licenses, particularly to Chevron, and at the time also to Repsol, Eni, which is an Italian company, and Maurel & which is a French company, to pump some oil and produce and sell that oil. What happened, and the idea of granting those licenses was try to leverage relief on sanctions to get to the elections that took place last year that were eventually stolen. So when Donald Trump came back in office, he basically froze those licenses, or stopped renewing, in particular, the foreign ones. But he did make an allowance, a return to allow Chevron, an American company, to continue to pump oil. That's only a small amount of the oil that or the production possibilities in Venezuela. The European companies have been frozen out. So production has increased in a small capacity because the Chevron license is very limited, but it does mean that a lot of the oil in Venezuela is simply lying under the ground right now. It's not being produced, both because of the lack of investment and technical capacity of Venezuela, as well as the lack of international investment and technical expertise that is necessary to get it. The idea that sort of this is about oil is quite frankly wrong. First of all, Trump is moving the United States to become, it is now one of the largest oil exporter and natural gas exporter. In fact, if Venezuelan oil were to come online, it would crimp into US's supply market. It would lower prices. It's something actually, quite frankly, Donald Trump doesn't want. Having said that, there are a number of very powerful U.S. oil companies that would love to be able to get in there and pump that oil. But the truth is the U.S. government doesn't necessarily want a massive uptick in production in Venezuela. Now, what we could see is, in fact, excuse me, what we could see, in fact, is other U.S. companies coming in and sort of, again, very limited licenses to protect them, because in part, what happened after 2019 when the U.S. imposed maximum pressure sanctions was that Iranian, Russian, and other companies began to move in and pump that oil. And that obviously is an irritant to the Trump administration. It is obviously, quite frankly, against U.S. national interest, a point that seemed to be lost when the sanctions were originally imposed. So now what the Trump administration is trying to do is trying to crowd out those anti-U.S. National companies from operating in Venezuela.
Okay, that's really interesting. Could you just quickly dig a little bit more into specifically who those players are and which sorts of companies we're seeing that Trump's trying to shove out?
So the Iranians have a number of operations in Venezuela. They're providing assistance more than, obviously Iran has its own oil, but they're using shadow fleets to be able to ship that oil to China, to India, in fact, and to Turkey. The Russians actually own a large chunk of the oil fields in Venezuela. They actually helped bail out the oil company when it was about to default on its debt. And they later, because of U.S. sanctions on Russia, they couldn't own the company. So instead, they sort of now own the oil rights of a number of very rich fields, which is called the Orinoco Belt in Venezuela. And as well, Turkey has been involved in this. There's also, because of the sanctions that the Trump administration imposed in 2019, which were also on the trading of the $160 billion worth of Venezuelan debt. What happened was U.S. companies couldn't trade those, nor could companies in the West, because there were so-called secondary sanctions imposed on the trading of that debt. Who bought that debt on markets? It was the Chinese, it was the Russians, it was the Qataris. So they now own a lot of the debt in Venezuela. So eventually, when it comes time to renegotiate the debt, eventually, when it comes time to, if you will, relet these oil fields and allow international investment in, unless there's some dramatic sort of revocation of these contracts, the Russians are going to be at the table, the Chinese are going to be at the table, and the Qataris are going to be at the table. And this is going to be a much more difficult process than just a sort of a regime collapse and a clean slate. There are going to be a lot of interests around the table that, quite frankly, are antithetical to U.S. and even Western interests. And certainly Donald Trump and his administration will not be around the table. But quite frankly, they own that, because it was their sanctions that really brought in the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese so close into the regime. They were already active before, but they simply filled the vacuum left by the pullout of U.S. and Western companies.
Now, finally, going back to the boats, Trump has, in the Caribbean, performed what the U.S. has called categorically an act of extrajudicial execution. And I wonder, how far is Trump going to go? Is the international community, are people within his own party going to continue to allow him to carry out these kinds of attacks with total impunity? There's been very little real backlash to what's happened in Venezuela. How long do you think this can go on for? Do you think there will be a red line where people just say, no, this is enough, this has to stop?
So we're beginning to see some people in the Republican Party begin to express their reservations about this. Includes U.S. Senator Rand Paul, but even former Bush administration officials are beginning to question whether this is legal, whether it does violate international law. But there's also the question of whether it violates U.S. law. The Trump administration has tried to justify this by saying that they've designated these organizations as being narco-terrorist, which is a term that never really existed before. But a terrorist designation does not allow you just to randomly kill civilians, especially with the show of force. If you look at the videos, and they're quite gruesome, and it's quite frankly appalling that Trump is showing them and spreading them around on Truth Social, his Twitter-like thing, because these are human beings that he's just showing who have not gone through a judicial process, who are on a boat. We don't know if they're drugs on the boat. But the risk here is you don't, even with the terrorist designation, without the approval of the U.S. Congress, you do not have the right to take lives. What a terrorist designation is intended to do is to impose sanctions on travel, on financial assets. It doesn't give the U.S. license to kill civilians. Now, Barack Obama, during the ISIS uptick, if you will, in violence in Iraq and Syria, did obviously use drones and bombing to take out a suspected terrorist cells in those cases of ISIS, but he did it with the authority of the Congress. Now, supposedly, according to rumors, the Defense Department, Justice Department are now scrambling to try to figure out how they can get the authority to be able to continue doing this. But even if they do, it will still require a vote of Congress and a significant lag and some very tough questions. Will that be enough to stop Donald Trump from just randomly shooting at boats, and asking questions later? Probably not. This has provided really good fodder for his base. And again, it reinforces this perception that he is fed for a long time, in fact, survived on and thrived on, that immigrants are a threat to the U.S. and U.S. lives, and they bring crime and drugs to the United States. And the truth is also, I want to reemphasize this, most of the cocaine, the vast majority of the cocaine that reaches the U.S. Is not coming from Venezuela. And there is no fentanyl, which is actually the major source of drug deaths, coming from Venezuela. The fentanyl comes from Mexico using Chinese precursor chemicals. This is all a fiction created by Donald Trump to stoke his anti-immigrant message and his sense of invasion by immigrants in the United States and a threat to U.S. citizens. It's a very dangerous game. We don't know where it leads, but honestly, words and actions now too, even if they're not intended to lead to violence, have consequences.